In part 2 of this lecture on visual literacy, we are going to break down a photograph from the Civil Rights era that appears in Remember the Journey to School Integration by Toni Morrison, which we're reading for this week. So if you haven't already done so, please download this graphic organizer that I posted to Blackboard. This is a graphic organizer that I modified from one that I located on the Getty Foundation's website. So what we're going to do here is analyze a photograph from the book using the 4-stage process for doing so outlined on this graphic organizer. So we're going to look at the photograph multiple times, and we're going to consider the photograph from a different perspective each time we look at it in order to really come to a full understanding of what is going on in the photograph. And we're going to be applying what we talked about in the previous lecture about symbolic codes as well as technical codes. So, all right, so you may want to take out Remember the Journey to School Integration and turn to page 39, or you can view along with me on the screen. Either way is fine, and we're going to be referring to the graphic organizer that I just showed you here, so make sure that you have that downloaded so you can follow along with me. Alright, so when it comes to analyzing photographs using the graphic organizer, your first step is to merely give a description of what is going on in the photograph. You're looking at who's in the photo, what objects do you see in the photo, and what the time and place of the photograph is. Like, what do you think the setting of the photograph is? So, based on what I've observed about this photograph, I see an African-American girl who looks like a young adult or a teenager in this image, and she is wearing a dress and she's carrying a book. I see that she's wearing sunglasses, so I can't see her eyes at all in the photograph. And behind her, we see a lot of white people. Most of them are women, although we have a few men, like this guy here in the hat, this guy with sunglasses. We also see a couple soldiers here in the image, but mostly women. And a lot of these women are holding books and they are wearing dresses. And I suspect that the setting of this photograph could be a school because people are carrying books. Typically, you know, you do that when you're headed to school. So I'm going to make that assumption there. And based on the style of clothing that people are wearing, I would judge this to be a photograph from the 1950s because these women are wearing knee-length dresses that are kind of poofy. That was a popular style in the 1950s. We don't often see this style of dress in today's world. So after we've described the photograph, then we move on to photographic elements, which includes symbolic codes, things like color, body language, things like that, as well as technical codes like the angle of the camera, how objects in the photograph are framed, what's the focal point of the photograph, and so on. Those things that we talked about in the previous lecture. So now we're going to talk about those photographic elements. So one thing I noticed is that the picture seems to slope downward, kind of like this. It seems like there's a line here going from here to here. It just seems like the action is kind of sloping, and when, according to our textbook, diagonal lines like that tend to suggest a sense of movement and action, and certainly this is an action scene. There are a lot of people in this photograph and there's a lot going on, so that's pretty interesting. And this particular camera shot is neither high angle or nor low angle. It's really just kind of straight on. So, but when we think about the framing of the photograph, we see that it is framed as a close-up. This photograph does convey a sense of intimacy with the subject of the photograph, who is this girl right here. She commands our attention because she is at the forefront of the image. Like, she's the one we're really paying attention to. One thing I noticed about the lighting, for the most part at the forefront of the photograph, the lighting is fairly bright, but in parts of the photograph, like here where the trees are located, it's somewhat dark there, largely because there are shadows back here on account of the trees. And it's really hard to determine color in this photograph because it is in black and white. But if you look at what the subject of the photograph is wearing, it looks like she has a white dress on with a gingham pattern at the bottom. And according to her textbook, white conveys a sense of cleanliness and innocence. So it signifies that, you know, maybe she's a young person, perhaps because she's wearing white. All right, so in terms of our third phase, that's when we actually interpret the photograph. That's when we consider things like what we might know about the context of the photograph, what information do we already have about it, We also consider how the people depicted in the photograph are thinking and feeling, and we think about how the photograph makes us as viewers feel. So we actually do have a lot of background knowledge about this photograph. This photograph was taken during the era of school integration. It was taken in 1957, which is 3 years after the Supreme Court made their historic Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. And this photograph was taken in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957. And this photograph depicts a young woman named Elizabeth Eckford, who was integrating Central High School in Little Rock, and she was a member of the Little Rock Nine. So you might have recognized this photograph from that context if you have some background knowledge about the Little Rock Nine. So her expression, her meaning Elizabeth, and I'll refer to her as Elizabeth going forward, not just the subject of the photograph. It's hard to figure out what she is thinking. But we do have some clues here in this photograph. It's hard to see her eyes because of her sunglasses, and we know, there's a saying, eyes are the window to the soul. The way our eyes appear can really reveal a lot about how we're feeling and what we're thinking, but we can't do that here. But one thing I noticed is that Elizabeth's mouth is turned downwards somewhat slightly, so it suggests that she is probably unhappy, or she's worried, or she's got something on her mind. And we see that her posture is straight for the most part, but it does kind of look to me like she is leaning forward slightly, almost like she's trying to move away from the people who are behind her, which is understandable. And I also noticed that her fist here is clenched. Like, it's hard to see kind of because it's black and white and it's an old image. But the way, her hand is grasping the book, it looks like her fist is being clenched. It's not just, her fist is not relaxed in this image. So usually when we walk around with our fists like that, we are upset or we are angry. So I can make a guess here that she's probably feeling that way. So I'm thinking that with all these people yelling at her and the fact that she is integrating a high school as an African American student, she's probably worried about feeling unwelcome at the school. She's probably worried about her safety, and she might be thinking about, how am I going to make it through this day? I can only imagine how challenging that day must have been for her and for the other students who integrated schools in the 1950s and 60s. So let's turn our attention now to the people standing behind Elizabeth. The woman here in the white dress, she has her mouth open, like she's yelling at Elizabeth, and if you look at her eyebrows, it looks like they're kind of turned inward, and that makes her look like she's angry. It doesn't look like she's yelling because she's happy. She's not yelling happy birthday to somebody. She looks really mad. And then if we look at this woman here, she's pretty interesting. If you notice, her arm is extended forward, almost like she's about to strike a blow, or like maybe she's thrown something, which is pretty interesting. There are a couple people in the back, like here, that look like they're smiling, which I'm really not sure why they'd be smiling unless they're happy that Elizabeth is being harassed by these people, or they might be smiling for some other reason. I don't really know, but that's kind of interesting to me. And if we look at the soldiers, it's hard to see in this version of the photograph. It's a lot more clear in the version in your book, but they have their mouths opening, like, they're perhaps issuing commands or yelling at people, perhaps. And in terms of how this photograph makes me feel, for one, it's shocking, as someone living in the world today who hasn't personally experienced racism, that people would have such blatantly racist attitudes towards her. There's a lot of racism today. Certainly, but I feel like a lot of the time it is less blatant. At least it feels that way to me. But, I'm coming at this as, a white person who hasn't experienced racism personally. So other people who have different backgrounds than I have might have a very different experience of racism and how overt it is. So in terms of also what else I felt, looking at this photograph, I definitely feel a sense of empathy for Elizabeth, that she's going through this. I mean, she's in high school, but she's still a child. And this has got to be a very traumatizing experience. But I also have a sense of admiration for her, that she was brave enough to do this. I don't know that I would have the personal strength to do something like that. So you know, on one hand, I feel really proud for her and I admire her. I also feel really shocked that people would have these sorts of attitudes towards her. So in our final phase of analyzing a photograph, we move to evaluation. We consider the photographer's purpose in taking it. We consider the audience of the photograph, and we also consider what is outside of the frame, what's going on beyond the borders of this image, and we think about why those items were left out. So I think that the photographer probably took this image because it was newsworthy. School integration was an important national event during the 1950s and the 1960s. So I think that the photographer is probably trying to capture what he felt would be an important moment in time. And I also wonder if the photographer was trying to elicit sympathy for Elizabeth. We can tell that she's the focal point of the picture. Our attention is drawn to her immediately. It's a close-up. So we have this sense of connection and intimacy with her that we wouldn't have if this was, you know, a wide-angle shot versus a close-up. So I'm aware that during the civil rights movement, a lot of photographers captured images like this one in order to call attention to what was going on and to call attention to the racist attitudes of a lot of people, and also to get people fired up about how African Americans were being treated. I know that was certainly the case in 1963 when riots were going on in Birmingham, and there was, you know, major clashes between the African American community and the police during that time. A lot of the photographs taken from that period of time in Birmingham were taken to anger people about what was happening and to get people to support the African American people in their fight for civil rights. So I think that possibly the photographer took this photograph for the same purpose. Perhaps he was sympathetic to the civil rights movement and school integration and wanted to call attention to the struggles that people were facing. And in terms of the audience for this photograph, I think it was very likely that it was for consumers of print and broadcast media, like any Americans who were following the news during that time. So I imagine that that's who this photograph was intended for. And in terms of what is outside of the frame of this photograph, what's beyond the borders that we see here, I wonder if there were more angry mobs outside of the frame of this photograph, and perhaps the photographer left out the angry mobs just because they didn't really add anything to the photograph. We already can see that there are lots of angry people. You know, we get the point. So maybe he didn't feel like adding more of them would make the photograph any more compelling. Also, if the photographer made this into a wide-angle shot, we would have less of a connection with Elizabeth Eckford, who is the focus of this particular photograph. And we also don't know, like maybe other people in the crowd behind her were just kind of people milling around and, you know, not really paying attention to what was happening. And certainly people like that are not compelling if the photographer's purpose was indeed to try to call attention to the struggle of African American students integrating the school. So that's my evaluation of this photograph. And again, I use that 4-step graphic organizer that I uploaded to Blackboard for you and that you can find a version of from the Getty Foundation's website to analyze this image. So now it's your turn. So you all have a copy of the Journey to School Integration. What I'd like you to do, and this isn't something you have to turn in, but I do feel like this would be really instructive for you to try this, but I'd like you to select a photograph or two from the book. And I'd like you to use the graphic organizer that I uploaded to Blackboard in order to go through this exercise. Describe the photo, think about the meaning of the technical and symbolic codes, which are the photographic elements, interpret what you think the photograph means, and evaluate the purpose and audience of the photograph. I think that you'll find that it's really interesting how much you can really read into a photograph like this.